So I want you to picture a sand dune, just right in the middle of the Sahara.
Okay.
It's like 120 degrees, the air is just completely bone dry, and the landscape looks entirely sterile. But then, right in the middle of that exact same dune, picture a state-of-the-art robotic olive press. And it's just churning out thousands of gallons of premium cold-pressed olive oil.
Right, which is a visual that completely breaks the brain.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because, you look at a map, you see this vast yellow desert, and your expectation is just, well, permanence. Like, we assume the map is fixed.
Yeah, but the thing is, we tend to categorize landscapes by what they currently lack, right?
Yeah.
Rather than what they could potentially hold. Like, the yellow on the map represents an absence of surface water and topsoil,
Yeah.
but it completely ignores the subterranean and atmospheric resources that are, actually right there.
And today, we are looking at how human engineering is fundamentally breaking those old rules of nature. So, welcome to today's deep dive. We are incredibly glad you're here with us. Yes, you, sitting right there listening, because we are taking you into the absolute vanguard of agricultural survival today.
We really are.
The topic on the table is the sheer transformative potential of solar-powered agriculture and advanced desalination in the world's most hyper-arid regions.
And to map all of this out, we're pulling from a really specific stack of research for you today. We're looking at academic literature on the adaptation of solar energy across the global south. We've got these incredibly detailed in vitro studies on the selection of stress-tolerant date palms. Plus, we're dissecting a technical framework for what engineers call desert orchard engineering.
Which is such a cool term.
It is. And we're also pulling operational data from the FII Institute on global desalination mega projects, like the Khafji plant.
Right. So our mission today is to explore exactly how the harshest environments on Earth, places battered by extreme solar radiation and buried under shifting mobile dunes, are essentially being weaponized. We're looking at this crazy convergence where engineers and biologists are stacking renewable energy, highly sophisticated hydroengineering, and extreme cellular resilience.
Yeah, to build massive, sustainable food systems in environments that actively want to kill them.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this.
So, to really understand the scale of this engineering feat, we have to look at the socioeconomic baseline of the regions where this is actually happening. When we talk about the global south, we're referencing a broad grouping across parts of Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Oceania.
Right.
And the populations here, they are navigating these deeply intertwined, interlocking crises. It's basically a feedback loop. You've got inadequate electricity access, severe clean water scarcity, stunted industrialization, and ultimately high food insecurity.
And the numbers in our sources, they paint a really stark picture of that feedback loop. In sub-Saharan Africa alone, over 590 million people lack access to a reliable electrical grid.
Yeah, 500 million people.
Which is just staggering. And the downstream effects of that are catastrophic for development, because without power, there is no cold chain.
Right. You can't refrigerate vaccines in a rural clinic.
Exactly. And you can't preserve a crop harvest before it reaches a market. So it forces this reliance on really expensive polluting stopgaps like diesel generators or burning biomass, which just completely drains local capital.
It creates a hard ceiling on human potential. Like, an economy cannot transition from subsistence to value-added production without reliable baseload power. You can't run mechanized agricultural equipment. You can't build resilient supply chains. The population just remains trapped in informal economies.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets crazy. When you look at the geographic data, the sheer absurdity of the energy poverty becomes so apparent. The models indicate that less than 0.1% of the global South's land area would be required to house enough solar panels to meet all of its current electricity demands.
Wait, less than 0.1%?
Less than 0.1%.
That is basically a statistical rounding error of landmass. It's like having a winning lottery ticket in your pocket, but lacking the bus fare to get to the prize office, right?
It's a perfect analogy.
The sun is this infinitely renewable resource just beating down on these regions, but the financial and infrastructural inertia has kept it totally locked away.
Historically, yes. The barrier to entry was always the cost of the technology itself. But we have crossed a massive technological threshold. Between 2010 and 2019, the global prices for solar photovoltaics, or PV, dropped by 82%.
82% in less than a decade.
Yeah, the manufacturing scale's tipped, so solar is now mathematically cheaper than fossil fuels in over 60% of the world.
But, if you're looking at those numbers, you might be thinking, great, solar is cheap, but so is coal if you build a big enough plant.
Mhm.
But the specific advantage of solar in the global south isn't just the price per kilowatt hour.
No, it's
It's
not.
the architecture of how it's deployed. Because traditional power generation relies on heavy centralization.
Right, and building a centralized grid requires massive upfront capital, decades of planning, and a really stable political environment to maintain thousands of miles of high-voltage transmission lines across rugged terrain.
Which just isn't always a reality.
Exactly, it's a brittle system. Solar, on the other hand, completely bypasses that requirement because it is inherently modular. You can literally deploy a single panel to power a vaccine refrigerator in a clinic,
Wow.
or you can scale it up to a localized microgrid powering a farming cooperative.
All without ever connecting to a national grid.
Yep, it is the ultimate decentralizing force.
So you establish that reliable power, and suddenly, that socioeconomic ceiling lifts. An agricultural community shifts from relying on animal labor to utilizing electric tractors and processing mills. Telecommunications networks stabilize.
Which brings digital literacy and market access.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, energy is the foundational domino. But energy alone doesn't solve the core biological constraint of a desert.
No, it doesn't, because you can't drink electricity.
Right. And electricity cannot grow a crop without the fundamental molecule of life. So fixing the energy gap really only matters because it provides the kinetic force necessary to solve the next massive crisis.
Which is absolute water scarcity. We have to shift our focus from capturing photons to capturing H2O. And when you look at the FII Institute data, the scale of human water consumption is just intense.
It really is.
The global average is around 142 liters per person per day. That covers basic hydration, cooking, washing, sanitation.
And in highly developed nations, it can spike well over 300 liters a day.
Easy. But in water-stressed regions, it plummets to survival levels. We're talking 10 to 50 liters.
Which is barely enough to stay alive. So historically, extracting fresh water in arid coastal regions meant relying on thermal desalination, which is just this brute force industrial process. You draw in millions of gallons of seawater, burn immense volumes of fossil fuels to basically boil it, capture the steam, and condense it into fresh water.
Yeah, and the financial cost of that was astronomical, not to mention the massive carbon footprint. Plus, the byproduct was this hot, highly toxic, hyper-concentrated salt brine that just got dumped back into the ocean.
Creating those awful dead zones that decimated local marine ecosystems. It was just a really ecologically devastating way to survive. But the technology detailed in these sources has moved so far beyond boiling the ocean. The modern paradigm is reverse osmosis, or RO.
Right. And RO removes heat from the equation entirely. It relies on intense mechanical pressure instead. So pumps force the seawater through these specialized semi-permeable membranes at highly engineered pressures. And the microscopic pores in the membrane allow the H2O molecules to pass through while physically blocking the larger salt ions and impurities. Because it relies on mechanical pressure rather than thermal phase changes, the energy efficiency is radically different.
How different?
Modern RO plants consume only 4 to 6 kilowatt hours of electricity to produce an entire cubic meter of fresh water.
Wow. And when you pair that really low energy requirement with cheap, abundant solar power, you get facilities like the Khafji plant in Saudi Arabia. And the scale of this operation is just staggering. We're talking about a footprint of 90 hectares of solar arrays.
That is massive.
It is an absolute sea of silicon and glass pointed at the desert sun, generating enough power to push 60,000 to 90,000 cubic meters of completely potable water through those RO membranes every single day.
Which provides complete water security for 150,000 people. And because the input energy is entirely solar, Khafji reduces greenhouse gas emissions and operational costs by up to 91% compared to those legacy thermal plants.
That's a game changer.
It really is. But the engineering advancements go beyond just the power source. They are actively mitigating the secondary environmental impacts, too. They use this algorithmic chemical management system, specifically something called eco-dosing.
Yeah, I was actually reading about eco-dosing in the operational breakdown. Because in older RO systems, the massive problem was biofouling, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Seawater is full of microscopic biological life, and when you push it against the membrane, that organic matter quickly builds up into this slime that basically clogs the pores. And the old solution was just to continuously dump heavy industrial biocides and chlorine into the water. to kill everything.
Which rapidly degrades those expensive membranes and, introduces toxic chemicals into the brine discharge. Ecodosing fundamentally changes this approach.
How so?
Instead of a continuous toxic flow, the system uses algorithmic monitoring to calculate the precise moment biological buildup begins. Then, it releases highly calibrated microbursts of biocides, just enough to clear the membrane without oversaturating the system.
So it extends the life of the infrastructure while drastically minimizing the chemical footprint.
Exactly. Now, Khafji is obviously this flagship mega project for a nation-state with unlimited capital and endless coastlines. But the truly disruptive application of this technology is happening totally off-grid.
Right.
The sources detail how engineers have basically shrunk this entire process down into modular, containerized RO units, like units that can be transported on the back of a flatbed truck deep into the Sahara.
Which is wild to think about. And the economics of these decentralized units are fascinating. The models show that for a capital expenditure of roughly $10 million, a region can deploy a localized RO system powered by a 30,000 square meter solar array.
So that's roughly the size of 4 football fields, utilizing about 15,000 PV panels.
Right. And that single off-grid footprint can draw from deep underground aquifers and output 10,000 cubic meters of fresh water daily. That is enough to sustain a city of 100,000 people, completely independent of a national grid or a coastline. And when you amortize that $10 million upfront cost over a standard 15-year operational contract, the math works out to roughly 56 cents per person per month.
Which just completely shatters the existing paradigms of resource management. When you can produce vast quantities of fresh water using only sunlight and deep, brackish aquifers, you sever the geographical constraints of traditional agriculture.
You no longer have to build farms where the rain falls or where rivers flow.
Exactly. This is the foundation of what researchers are calling island agriculture.
Island agriculture. I mean, it is such an evocative term. You're creating a highly productive, entirely self-sustaining green zone, a literal island of biology, surrounded by an ocean of sterile, hyper-arid sand.
And countries like Mauritania or the UAE, where per capita agricultural water consumption can hit 500 liters a day, they are looking at this as a matter of strict national security.
Oh, absolutely. They are decoupling their food supply from erratic climate patterns and imported fossil fuels. You just locate a deep, brackish groundwater aquifer that has basically sat undisturbed for thousands of years. Drop your solar array and your containerized RO unit onto the dune right above it, and you literally manufacture an oasis on demand.
But, the immediate logical leap here is dangerous.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, if we can generate tens of thousands of cubic meters of fresh water in the middle of the desert, the instinct is to just clear out the dunes, lay down some topsoil, and start running massive central pivot irrigation sprinklers like we do in, say, the American Midwest.
Right. Why aren't we just spraying that water everywhere and planting massive traditional farms?
Because attempting surface-level irrigation in a hyper-arid environment is a highly efficient way to destroy the landscape. The physics of the atmosphere just will not allow it. In the Sahara, the potential evaporation rate exceeds 3,000 millimeters per year.
3,000?
Yeah. The air is so devoid of moisture and the solar radiation is so intense that surface water is immediately vaporized and pulled straight back into the atmosphere.
So you're basically just spending millions of dollars on solar infrastructure to pump vapor into the sky.
Exactly. And it is worse than just wasting the water, because even the most highly purified reverse osmosis water contains minute traces of dissolved minerals and salts. When you spray that water onto the hot sand, the H2O molecules evaporate instantly, but the heavy mineral and salt ions are left behind on the surface.
Oh, wow.
And over a surprisingly short period of time, this constant evaporation cycle creates a lethal, concrete-like salt crust on the top of the sand. It renders the soil highly toxic, chokes off oxygen to the roots, and permanently sterilizes the land.
So wait, we have this precious, expensive water, but we literally cannot let it touch the surface of the desert. The atmosphere is just too aggressive. To keep the water, agriculture essentially has to hide it.
Which brings us to the actual mechanical framework of desert orchard engineering. It requires an unprecedented level of precision. The entire goal is to completely bypass the evaporation-transpiration interface at the surface.
Right.
And to do that, engineers have developed the concept of subsurface lenses.
Yeah, I found the mechanics of the subsurface lens to be brilliant. Because instead of giving the trees a shower, which just evaporates and leaves a sunburn of salt, they lay miles of pressurized, highly calibrated tubing deep underground. They are injecting the desalinated water directly into the root zones of the plants, sometimes up to 2 meters deep.
They create this highly localized subterranean pocket of moisture directly in the rhizosphere, the biologically active zone surrounding the roots. And because the water is injected 2 meters down, the top layer of sand remains bone dry, acting as a thermal and physical insulator.
Which completely cuts off the evaporation pathway to the hot desert air above, while providing the plant with a stable, continuous water supply below. But, sand is notoriously porous. It has virtually no capacity to hold water. So if you pump hundreds of gallons of water 2 meters deep into a dune, gravity and the porosity of the sand are just going to pull that water straight down into the bedrock, way beyond the reach of any plant roots.
That is the secondary challenge of the subsurface lens, and solving it requires physically altering the geology of the dune.
Wow.
Before planting, engineers use deep trenching equipment to lay down impermeable clay-based liners beneath the root zone. And in more advanced setups, they actually inject highly specific chemical clumping agents into the sand at precise depths.
What do those do?
These agents basically bind the sand particles together, creating an artificial impermeable floor just below the root mass.
So they're essentially building an underground bathtub. The water goes in through the pressurized tubes, the artificial floor stops it from sinking away, and the dry sand on top stops it from evaporating. It is basically an underground IV drip for the orchard.
The IV drip analogy is really highly accurate, especially when we look at the chemistry of the water being injected. Operating an RO plant to produce 100% pure, totally desalinated water requires exponential amounts of energy. The closer you get to pure H2O, the harder the pumps have to work.
Right, diminishing returns.
Exactly. So to optimize the economics, the water injected into these subsurface lenses is often only partially desalinated. It retains a significant degree of mineralization and salt.
But wait, we just established that salt accumulation creates a toxic crust that sterilizes the soil. If you are constantly pumping salty water into an enclosed underground bathtub, the plant is just trapped in a stagnant, highly mineralized puddle. How does a tree not just drink that toxic soup and immediately die?
It absolutely would die if the engineers didn't actively manipulate the ionic balance of the water. The primary threat to the plant is the sodium ion, Na plus Mart. Sodium is highly toxic to cellular machinery. It disrupts protein synthesis and causes the plant to lose the ability to regulate its own internal water pressure.
Okay, so how do they fight that?
To neutralize this threat, the hydro-engineers flood the irrigation water with a massive counterdose of calcium ions, C2 plus ter.
Okay, so they're flooding the root zone with calcium to competitively inhibit the sodium. It's basically a microscopic bouncer at the door of the cellular membrane.
That is precisely the mechanism. At the microscopic level of the root membrane, calcium and sodium actually compete for the exact same entry channels into the plant's vascular system.
Oh, I see.
So by artificially elevating the calcium levels in the subsurface lens, the calcium ions bind to the cellular membranes of the roots. This maintains their structural permeability so the plant can continue absorbing water while physically blocking the toxic sodium ions from entering.
That is incredible. But the plants are not just passive recipients of this engineered water, right? The research details how the biology of these trees actively recognizes the extreme stress of this environment and literally, physically re-engineers its own root structures to survive.
Yeah, the phenotypic plasticity. The ability of an organism to change its physical traits in response to environmental stress is just remarkable here. When exposed to the high salinity of a subsurface lens, the root systems of these specialized trees actually alter their cellular architecture. The roots will actively increase their overall diameter and specifically expand the size of their periderm cells.
And the periderm is the outer, bark-like protective tissue of the root, right?
Correct. By expanding and thickening these outer cells, the plant constructs an apoplastic barrier. It's basically a fortified physical wall designed to further restrict the movement of toxic ions from the soil into the xylem, which is the internal vascular tissue of the plant. And simultaneously, the plant alters the xylem itself.
Right. The study showed they increase the diameter of their xylem vessels. Wider tubes mean they can pull water up with less hydraulic resistance, which compensates for the fact that the salty soil is actively trying to pull water away from them through osmotic pressure.
Exactly. And engineers actually incorporate this biological behavior into their maintenance strategies, specifically regarding the life cycle of fine roots.
Hmm.
A tree relies on millions of microscopic, hair-like fine roots to perform the actual absorption of water and nutrients. In these highly saline desert orchards, engineers use precise irrigation timing to induce a hyper-accelerated turnover rate of these fine roots.
So they basically treat the fine roots as disposable salt sinks.
Yes, exactly.
The plant sends out a fine root, it absorbs the brackish water, and inevitably, some toxic sodium breaches the cellular walls. But before that sodium can travel up the vascular system and poison the delicate leaves in the trunk, the tree intentionally sheds the root and rapidly grows a new one. And the shed roots just remain in the soil, locking the toxic salt away from the main organism.
It is a continuous microscopic cycle of sacrificial biology. But even with the solar-powered RO, the underground IV drips, the artificial clay floors, and the calcium inhibition, the environment just remains exceptionally hostile. You cannot plant a standard agricultural crop in a subsurface saline lens and expect it to survive. The baseline biology of the crop must be hyper-resilient.
So we're talking about deploying a biological arsenal. Industrial desert orchards rely exclusively on elite cultivars that have been selected for extreme halophytic or salt-tolerant traits.
Yes.
And the source material outlines the success of super high-density, or SHD, olive systems. The variance in how different olive cultivars handle salt stress is basically a masterclass in evolutionary strategy.
It really is. The researchers analyzed the defense mechanisms across various genetic lines. The Arbosana cultivar, for instance, exhibits incredible raw endurance. It can maintain its biomass and continue active photosynthesis even when soil salinities reach 75 millimolar of sodium chloride. To put that in perspective, at that concentration, the cellular structures of most traditional crops would instantly collapse.
And then you have the Lexiana cultivar, which takes a more active approach to internal chemistry. It survives by maintaining a highly elevated ratio of potassium to sodium within its cells. It actively pumps potassium in from the soil to outcompete the toxic sodium, protecting its internal enzymes.
But the most visually striking survival mechanism belongs to cultivars like Calamon and Frantoio. They utilize a strategy of active compartmentalization.
Oh, this part blew my mind.
When the root barriers fail and toxic salt enters the vascular system, these trees refuse to let it reach their photosynthetic leaves. Instead, they actively shunt the toxic ions into the woody tissue of their trunks and branches.
They intentionally turn their own structural wood into a hazardous waste repository to keep their leaves functional.
Exactly. The physiological data shows that under severe, prolonged salt stress, these specific cultivars will increase their wood biomass by up to 24.9%.
It's crazy.
They literally grow thicker, denser trunks on demand just to create more physical storage capacity for the toxic salt they are absorbing.
It is just an incredible display of resilience. Yeah. But, if olives are the resilient infantry of the desert orchard, the date palm is the undisputed heavy artillery. The sources refer to the date palm as the halophytic workhorse, and its genetic capacity to withstand punishing environments exceeds almost any other viable agricultural crop.
Oh, without a doubt. When we measure soil salinity in agricultural science, we use a metric called electrical conductivity, measured in decicemens per meter, or DSM. It's used as a proxy because pure water doesn't conduct electricity well, but water heavy with dissolved salt ions does. The higher the electrical conductivity, the saltier and more toxic the environment.
And for a standard non-halophytic plant, once the soil hits roughly 3 or 4 DSM, the osmotic stress becomes too great, right?
Right.
The plant stops growing, yields plummet, and eventually it dies.
But when we look at the elite date palm cultivars selected for desert orchards, specific genetic lines like the Lulu and the Barhi, their tolerance thresholds are almost unbelievable. Their 50% yield reduction threshold, meaning the extreme point of stress where the plant's fruit production is finally cut in half, is not reached until the soil salinity hits 12 ds.
12 DSM, 12 ds per meter. That is just, it's basically poison to a normal plant.
Yeah.
And the tree is still churning out half of its maximum biological output.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. To isolate these elite genetics, to find the exact cultivars capable of this, scientists aren't just planting seeds in the desert and hoping for the best.
No, definitely not.
They're essentially running a botanical boot camp in petri dishes, intentionally torturing plant cells with salt and simulated droughts just to see which ones are tough enough to survive the Sahara through in vitro selection.
Yeah, the in vitro methodology is ruthless but highly efficient. Researchers take undifferentiated date palm cells and culture them in controlled petri dishes. They strip away the entire complex structure of the tree, isolating just the pure cellular machinery. Then they subject those naked cells to simulated extremes.
I was reading the methodology in the in vitro study, and I noticed they didn't just flood the petri dishes with sodium chloride to test salt tolerance. They also introduced this massive polymer, PEG 8000.
Yeah, yes.
And it acts like a molecular sponge, right? It physically binds to the water molecules in the dish so the plant cells cannot access them. So it's essentially creating a microscopic, inescapable drought.
That is precisely how it functions. Polyethylene glycol, or PEG 8000, perfectly replicates the extreme osmotic stress of a desert environment without adding actual toxins. By portraying these cellular cultures with heavy salt concentrations and chemical droughts, researchers can empirically measure survival rates across different genetic lines.
The results were clear, right?
Very. For example, the data showed the Barhi cultivar dramatically outperforming the Halali cultivar when subjected to the PEG 8000 drought simulation.
And observing the cells that survive these extremes reveals the internal chemical warfare the plant is waging. As the salinity and drought stress increase in the petri dish, the surviving date palm cells instantly begin synthesizing and stockpiling massive quantities of an amino acid called proline.
Yes. The role of proline is critical to cellular survival under stress. Proteins and vital enzymes operate based on their highly complex physical folds. When a cell is subjected to extreme salt toxicity or dehydration, those delicate proteins begin to denature. They literally unfold and lose their function, which leads to cell death.
Right.
Proline molecules act as structural stabilizers. The cell floods its own interior with proline, which physically wraps around the enzymes and cellular membranes, stabilizing their structures and protecting them from the toxic ions.
It is literally molecular bubble wrap. The cell recognizes it is under attack and encases its internal organs to prevent them from disintegrating. And the studies noted a really counterintuitive biological reaction to this process. A short, acute exposure to toxic salt, roughly a 3-day window, actually stimulates cellular growth in the date palms before the environment becomes lethal.
It basically acts as an environmental catalyst. The acute stress triggers the genetic pathways responsible for defense mechanisms, kicking the production of proline and other protective compounds into overdrive, ultimately making the resulting cellular structure more robust than a cell grown in perfect, unstressed conditions.
Like as the cell is fighting a massive two-front war. You have the osmotic stress, the heavy salt concentration outside the cell, physically creating a pressure vacuum that tries to suck the water out of the plant. And simultaneously, you have the toxic stress, the sheer chemical damage caused when those chloride and sodium ions manage to breach the cellular membrane.
And when those toxic ions enter the intracellular space, they interact with the plant's metabolism to create reactive oxygen species, or ROS. These are highly unstable, volatile molecules that frantically seek out electrons, violently tearing apart the cell's DNA, lipids, and proteins in the process.
So the biological response to ROS is the deployment of specialized antioxidant enzymes, like superoxide dismutase. Their entire biological purpose is to basically hunt down and neutralize those highly volatile molecules before they can shred the cell's DNA.
Right.
It is a microscopic search and destroy mission happening millions of times a second.
And date palms are uniquely equipped for this warfare. Comparative analyses in the research show that when subjected to the same extreme saline environments, date palm cells accumulate significantly less intracellular chloride than other highly resilient crops, like chickpeas.
Which proves what?
It proves that beyond just neutralizing the damage, they possess an incredibly efficient, active biological mechanism at the membrane level that blocks the chloride from ever entering in the first place.
Okay, so we have spent an immense amount of time detailing the mechanics of this system. We have infinite solar potential, highly efficient RO desalination, localized underground subsurface lenses, calcium mitigation, and genetically elite halophytes stockpiling proline and superoxide dismutase in petri dishes.
It's an undeniable triumph of human engineering and botanical science.
Absolutely. But, this raises an important question. If you're looking at these CapEx numbers, you might be thinking exactly what I thought. How does this ever scale from a brilliant scientific trial into a viable global industry? Like one capable of actually addressing the food insecurity of millions in the global south.
Well, that transition from laboratory proof of concept to industrial reality relies entirely on the cold calculus of economics. And the financial modeling required to build a functioning desert orchard is brutal. It requires a staggering mobilization of capital.
Yeah, let's look at the financial breakdown of the source reports. If an investment group or a sovereign wealth fund wants to establish a relatively modest 50-hectare super high-density olive farm in a hyper-arid off-grid region, the initial capital expenditure, the capex required before a single seed even goes into the ground, is modeled at approximately $202 million.
Right. 202 million. It is a massive financial barrier to entry. And understanding that number requires looking at the sheer logistical weight of the infrastructure. The land itself is mathematically negligible. Barren desert is cheap. The $202 million is absorbed by the deep tech infrastructure and the logistical nightmare of transporting it.
Because you are paying for the heavy containerized reverse osmosis units, the massive industrial solar arrays and battery banks, and the miles of highly specialized pressure-calibrated subsurface irrigation tubing that has to be trench-laid beneath the dunes. And you also have to import heavy specialized mechanized agricultural equipment capable of operating in deep sand and extreme heat without suffering catastrophic engine failure.
Furthermore, the massive upfront cost dictates the ultimate business model of the farm. You cannot invest $200 million to grow generic, bulk commodity crops. The profit margins will never amortize the debt. The economics force the operation to target the absolute highest tiers of the premium market. You must produce a luxury product.
Which perfectly explains the necessity of vertical integration. The models include the construction of a state-of-the-art, $250,000 processing mill directly on site, right next to the solar panels and the olive trees.
Right, because if you want to command premium luxury prices for olive oil, you have to guarantee 24-hour freshness.
Yeah, you can't load raw olives onto a truck and drive them hundreds of miles through a sweltering desert to a processing plant. They'll degrade and oxidize. You have to harvest, press, and bottle the oil simultaneously right there on the dune.
You are not just financing a farm, you are financing a high-tech, vertically integrated, off-grid industrial manufacturing facility. And once that $202 million is spent, and the elite Arbosana saplings are planted in their subsurface lenses, the investors face the most perilous phase of the project.
The pre-revenue gap.
Exactly, the pre-revenue gap. Because biology takes time. An olive tree, even a fast-growing elite cultivar, will not produce commercially viable yields of fruit for 3 to 8 years. Date palms require a slightly shorter timeline of 3 to 4 years, but during that massive waiting period, the facility generates absolutely zero revenue, while the operational expenses, the OPEX, run continuously.
And the ongoing OPEX for a highly technical facility in a hostile environment is immense. The solar arrays require constant maintenance. Saharan dust storms can bury the panels or sandblast the glass, instantly destroying their efficiency, requiring automated cleaning systems. The delicate RO membranes require routine chemical backwashing and expensive replacements. And the highly specialized technical labor force required to run the hydroengineering and the digital sensors must be salaried. The financial models project the monthly operational expenses for that 50-hectare farm at $25,883.
Over 25 grand.
Every single month for up to 8 years while waiting for the trees to mature. It requires a massive financial runway. The reports estimate a necessary cash buffer of nearly $776,000 just to survive the juvenile stage of the orchard. And those financial models assume a frictionless operational environment, which, does not exist. Operating at this scale in the global south introduces severe logistical friction. There is a profound lack of existing maintenance networks. If a high-pressure RO pump suffers a catastrophic failure or the digital sensors governing the eco-dosing system malfunction, you can't easily source local replacement parts or technicians. You are entirely reliant on expensive, slow international supply chains.
Then there are the physical hazards of the hardware. Solar panels have a finite lifespan, and when a 90-hectare array eventually degrades, the facility is left with thousands of tons of toxic electronic waste containing heavy metals like lead and cadmium, which requires highly complex disposal logistics in regions that often lack environmental waste infrastructure.
And perhaps the most complex friction point is land acquisition. Because just because a vast expanse of desert appears empty on a satellite map does not mean it is devoid of historical or cultural significance.
Absolutely.
Nomadic populations often hold deep historical usage rights, grazing routes, or ancestral claims to the land. Parachuting a massive, gated industrial agricultural facility into these spaces without extensive community integration and legal clarity leads to severe sociopolitical conflict. And we're not taking any sides on those specific regional political disputes, but from a purely logistical standpoint, without navigating those land ownership hurdles delicately, these projects will hit a wall.
Which brings us to the ultimate framework researchers use to evaluate these massive megaprojects, the WEFE nexus: water, energy, food, and environment. It is an analytical model that recognizes you cannot alter one of these pillars without sending massive shockwaves through the other three. When desert orchard engineering is executed successfully with respect for that nexus, it ceases to be just an agricultural project. It becomes an engine for a macroeconomic revolution.
We can observe the tangible socioeconomic impacts in the data. Across large swaths of the global south, the failure of traditional rain-fed agriculture due to shifting climate patterns is driving a massive destabilizing outmigration.
Yeah.
The youth are abandoning rural, arid regions and flooding into increasingly overcrowded urban centers because the land can no longer sustain a living.
But when you drop a highly capitalized, high-tech solar agricultural facility into a rural province, you fundamentally alter the labor market. You are no longer relying on low-skilled, subsistence agrarian labor. You suddenly require solar grid technicians, RO hydro engineers, high-end agronomists, digital logistics managers, and heavy machinery operators.
It creates a localized, high-value, knowledge-based economy. It provides a highly lucrative alternative to urban migration, anchoring the youth population and stabilizing the regional demographics. And the production capacities prove that the agricultural yield can support this economic shift. In Egypt, heavily scaled efforts in desert orchard engineering resulted in the production of 610,000 tons of table olives in 2019 alone.
610,000 tons.
610,000 tons of food pulled directly out of the sand. And the macroeconomic models for other nations are even more aggressive. In Mauritania, projections indicate that a successful, widespread national transition toward solar-powered desalination and green energy agricultural infrastructure could theoretically boost their national gross domestic product by a staggering 60%.
A 60% expansion of a national economy is paradigm shifting. However, we must view those projections through a lens of pragmatic reality. The consensus across the analytical sources is unambiguous. These projects will absolutely fail if they are simply left to unregulated market forces.
Oh, for sure.
Navigating the immense capex, the infrastructural hurdles, and the delicate land use rights requires highly sophisticated, forward-thinking governmental policy frameworks. They require robust microfinance structures to allow local cooperatives to participate rather than just foreign conglomerates, and transparent regulatory oversight to ensure the WEFE nexus remains balanced.
It is a massive, complex undertaking. And looking at the sheer difficulty of it, the $200 million price tags, the toxic waste management, the constant battle against osmotic stress and sandstorms, it forces a fundamental question. If I'm an investor looking at a $202 million price tag and an 8-year wait for olives, why on earth do I invest in the Sahara instead of just traditional farmland in the Midwest?
Because the assumption that traditional temperate farmland will remain stable and abundant is fundamentally flawed. Global agriculture is facing a severe crisis of arable land. Urban sprawl is paving over fertile valleys, aggressive industrial farming is causing massive topsoil depletion, and shifting, unpredictable climate patterns are subjecting traditional rain-fed agriculture to catastrophic cycles of historic droughts and unprecedented flooding.
So the easy land is disappearing, and the stable climates are becoming unstable.
Precisely. Desert orchard engineering is not merely an expensive high-tech novelty meant to supplement traditional farming. It is rapidly becoming the necessary blueprint for future global survival. We are running out of optimal, naturally forgiving environments. To maintain global food security, human engineering must learn how to efficiently, sustainably farm the hardest, most unforgiving landscapes on the planet.
It is about adapting to the reality of the map we actually have, rather than the map we wish we had. Let's recap the incredible journey we've taken through that map today. We started by examining the deeply intertwined crises of the Global South and how the massive untapped potential of decentralized solar power acts as the first domino of modernization.
We explored how that endless solar energy is being utilized to power zero-carbon reverse osmosis, severing the constraints of traditional geography to create island agriculture.
We dug deep underground to dissect the precision of desert orchard engineering, bypassing the aggressive evaporation of the desert atmosphere with localized subsurface 5E drips and artificial clay floors.
We zoomed in to a cellular level to understand the biological armor of elite halophytes, how date palms and olives battle osmotic and toxic stress by expanding paraderm cells, compartmentalizing salt in their wood, and stockpiling proline and superoxide dismutase in petri dishes.
And finally, we zoomed all the way out to run the staggering $202 million math of bringing this technology into the real world, balancing the complex WEFE nexus of water, energy, food, and environment to fundamentally alter regional economies.
It is a comprehensive look at how multidisciplinary human ingenuity is quite literally moving dunes. But as we consider the future trajectory of this field, I want to leave you with one final concept that builds upon everything we have discussed.
Okay, what is it?
Well, we have spent this deep dive talking about the convergence of heavy hydroengineering and halophytic biology. But the next massive frontier of the desert orchard is entirely digital.
Digital, you mean like integrating software into the biology?
Exactly. Researchers are currently looking deep into the genomic structure of these resilient plants, specifically working to map and sequence the functional genes within what they call the SOS pathway, the salt overly sensitive pathway.
Okay.
This is the genetic code that triggers the proline and the apoplastic barriers. Now, imagine combining that profound genetic understanding with the rapidly emerging technology of digital twins.
A digital twin. So creating a fully realized virtual replica of the physical farm in a software program.
A real-time, molecularly accurate digital replica. Visualize a massive 10,000-hectare Saharan olive and date orchard. Above the canopy, fleets of autonomous drones equipped with high-resolution thermal imaging cameras constantly patrol the sky, measuring the minute fluctuations in leaf temperature that indicate early osmotic stress.
Wow.
And below ground, thousands of microsensors embedded in the artificial clay floors continuously transmit data on the exact moisture levels, electrical conductivity, and calcium to sodium ratios of the subsurface lenses.
With all of that massive localized data feeding back into a central artificial intelligence.
Creating a living digital twin. In the very near future, managing these mega projects won't look like traditional farming. We will be tracking the exact molecular salinity stress and the real-time SOS pathway activation of a single date palm among millions. And a central software program will analyze that stress and autonomously adjust the flow of the underground water, IV drip altering the exact chemical ratio of calcium competitive inhibitors by the millimeter in real time, monitored by an agronomist from a laptop halfway across the world.
Tracking the microscopic stress of a single tree among millions of trees and adjusting its chemistry in real time. You know, we started this deep dive talking about maps, how looking at a massive yellow desert implies an expectation of permanence, an assumption that the landscape is barren, empty, and fixed. But listening to this entire breakdown, from the massive solar arrays powering the eco-dosing, down to the biological armor of the fine roots, all the way to the digital twins managing the chemistry from the sky, it is incredibly clear that the map isn't fixed at all. It is just finally being drawn in green. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the map, keep looking beneath the surface, and keep exploring the brilliant, complex ways human ingenuity is greening the desert. Until next time.